August 16, 1977, did not begin like history. It began like an ordinary Tuesday. The sun rose over Los Angeles in a quiet, golden haze. Dean Martin sat alone in his kitchen, coffee untouched, the newspaper folded but unread. He wasn't a man easily shaken. Fame had hardened him in certain ways. Time had thickened his skin. But that morning, something felt wrong. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just wrong. He couldn't explain it. He wouldn't even try. He wasn't a mystical man. He didn't believe in signs or premonitions. But for reasons he could not name, one thought repeated in his mind like a scratched record. Go see Elvis. He checked the clock. 6:03 a.m. He hadn't spoken to Elvis Presley in weeks. They were close, yes, but not the kind of friends who called daily. Their friendship was built on something quieter, mutual understanding. Two men who had tasted the highest peaks of fame and survived its storms. Still, the feeling would not leave. By 8:00 a.m., Dean had made up his mind. He didn't call ahead. He didn't tell anyone. He simply got in his car. And he drove. 6 hours from Los Angeles to Memphis. No music playing. No stops. No explanations. Just a silent urgency he didn't understand. When Dean Martin pulled up to the gates of Graceland at 2:17 p.m., the Tennessee heat hung heavy in the air. The estate stood peaceful and still like it always had. Too still. The security guard recognized him immediately. "Mr. Martin, we weren't expecting you." "I know," Dean said calmly. "Is he home?" "Yes, sir, he's upstairs, resting." Dean nodded. He didn't smile. Something in his chest tightened. He had been to Graceland many times before. Laughter had once filled these halls. Music had echoed down the staircase. Late-night card games, stories, jokes. But that afternoon, the house felt different. Quiet in a way that didn't feel restful. Quiet in a way that felt suspended. Like something was waiting. Upstairs, Elvis Presley was awake. He had barely slept. The previous months had been heavy. Touring had taken its toll. His body felt tired in ways applause could no longer fix. Fame, once electric, now felt like a weight pressing against his ribs. He wasn't sad in the way newspapers like to write. He wasn't dramatic. He was tired. Tired of expectations. Tired of being the king. Tired of being larger than life. He longed for something simple, a moment where he could be just Elvis, not the symbol. When the knock came at his bedroom door, he assumed it was staff. "Yeah, it's me," came the voice. A voice he recognized instantly. "Dean." Elvis smiled. He hadn't known he needed to see him until that exact second. "Come on in." Dean stepped inside. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. No grand greeting. No performance. Just two men who had lived long enough to know when words weren't necessary. "You look tired," Dean said quietly. Elvis gave a half-smile. "You drove all the way here just to insult me." Dean shrugged, felt like I should. That was the truth. No deeper explanation. Just instinct. What happened next was not dramatic. There were no shocking confessions. No cinematic collapse. Instead, what filled those next 20 minutes was something far more human. Honesty. Not about secrets. Not about scandals. About exhaustion. About identity. About what happens when the world builds a throne beneath you and forgets you're still flesh and bone. Elvis sat at the edge of his bed. Dean pulled up a chair. They talked. About music. About how performing used to feel like flying. About how sometimes now it felt like surviving. Elvis admitted something quietly. "I miss when singing was just singing." Dean nodded. He understood. Both men had built careers on charisma, on charm, on the ability to make a crowd feel something larger than themselves. But charisma is expensive. It costs energy. It costs privacy. It costs peace. And sometimes it costs health. "You ever wish," Elvis asked softly, "that you could disappear for a while?" Dean didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," he admitted. That was the moment. Not a confession. Not a dramatic reveal. Just two legends speaking as men. There was laughter, too. Dean told a story about an old Vegas show where everything went wrong, lights flickering, band off tempo, microphones cutting out, and how sometimes the best performances happen when things aren't perfect. Elvis laughed harder than he had in days. That laughter mattered, more than either of them realized. After a while, Dean stood up. He didn't know why, but something in him felt steadier now. The urgency that had driven him across states was fading. "You gonna rest?" Dean asked. "Yeah," Elvis said. "Think I will." They walked toward the door together. At the threshold, Elvis said something that Dean would replay in his mind for years. "Thanks for coming." 3 simple words. But the way he said them, sincere, unguarded, lodged themselves deep in Dean's chest. "You didn't have to." Dean paused. "Yeah," he said, "I did." Dean left Graceland at 2:37 p.m., 20 minutes after he arrived upstairs. He did not know that within hours the world would change. He did not know that history would record that day forever. He did not know that he would become the last friend to see Elvis Presley alive. When the news broke later that afternoon, Dean froze. Elvis Presley had died at 42. Official statements would follow, medical reports would follow, analysis would follow. But Dean didn't hear any of it clearly. He heard only one thing in his mind. "Thanks for coming." And suddenly, he understood why he had driven. Not to save. Not to stop. Not to change history. But to make sure his friend did not spend his final hours feeling alone. In the days that followed, reporters would ask questions. What was he like? Did he seem unwell? Did he say anything unusual? Dean kept his answers simple. He was tired, he said. He was human. He never dramatized those 20 minutes. He never embellished. But privately, something shifted inside him. Because here is the truth. Being the last person someone speaks to is a burden. You replay every word. You wonder if you missed something. You wonder if you could have stayed longer. You wonder if leaving at 2:37 instead of 3:00 would have changed fate. That kind of wondering does not fade easily. Dean would later say something in an interview that few people fully understood at the time. Sometimes showing up is the only thing you can give. It wasn't guilt speaking. It was reflection. He had shown up. Not because he was called. Not because he was invited. But because something inside him knew. And in those final 20 minutes, 2 men stripped away fame, applause, headlines, and legend. And just talked. Years later, people would speculate. They would ask if Elvis seemed different. If he said something profound. If there were secrets. Dean never fed those stories. Because the real truth was quieter. And far more powerful. There was no dramatic confession. No cinematic final speech. There was gratitude. There was laughter. There was fatigue. There was humanity. And sometimes that is more haunting than tragedy. Dean carried those 20 minutes for the rest of his life. Not because of what was said, but because of what it meant. He had listened to that quiet inner voice. He had made the drive. He had shown up. And when the world remembered Elvis Presley as an icon, a legend, a symbol, Dean remembered him as a man sitting on the edge of a bed, smiling softly, saying, "Thanks for coming." And that was enough. The days after August 16 did not move like normal days. They moved like a slow, heavy dream, the kind where sound feels far away and time refuses to behave. Dean Martin woke up the next morning expecting the usual rhythm of life to return, coffee, routine, a familiar emptiness that came with being famous and tired. But the moment he opened his eyes, the truth rushed back in like cold water. Elvis was gone. Not gone in the way headlines use the word, not gone as in a career ended or a tour stopped, but gone in the final way that changes the air in a room forever. Dean sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. He kept seeing the same image in his mind. The doorway upstairs, Elvis's face softened by exhaustion, and the way those three simple words, "Thanks for coming," had carried more weight than a stadium full of applause. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't poetic. It was honest, and that honesty, more than anything, made Dean feel like he was holding something fragile that no one else could see. Within hours, the world began turning Elvis Presley into history. Phones rang. Managers spoke in urgent voices. People in suits made decisions like they were repairing a machine. The news moved faster than grief. Cameras waited outside gates. Radio hosts talked like they personally owned his memory. Rumors grew in the spaces where facts weren't ready yet. Dean watched it all from a distance, as if he were standing behind a glass wall while people shouted on the other side. He understood the pattern because he had lived it too. When a famous man falls, the public does not grieve the person first. They grieve the idea. They reach for a story that makes sense. They want neat reasons. They want something they can repeat without trembling. But Dean couldn't find a neat reason for what happened, and he didn't trust neat reasons anymore. All he knew was that he had been there, and that fact had started to feel less like comfort and more like a stone in his pocket that grew heavier each time he tried to ignore it. In Memphis, Graceland filled with people like a house pulled into a storm. Friends arrived with stunned faces and pressed mouths. Staff moved through rooms carrying trays of water, messages, phone receivers, paperwork, small tasks that gave them something to do so they didn't have to stand still with the truth. Someone cried in a hallway and then apologized for crying, as if grief required permission. Dean walked through the rooms quietly, not like a celebrity returning to a familiar mansion, but like a man stepping into a space where the air had changed. The house still looked like Elvis's house, but it no longer felt like his. That was the cruel thing about loss. Objects stay the same while meaning disappears. A chair becomes just a chair. A lamp becomes just a lamp. A hallway becomes a hallway instead of a path to a living friend. And Dean kept thinking, without wanting to, about that upstairs room and those 20 minutes, because they were now sealed inside him, a private moment the world could not touch. People asked him questions almost immediately. They meant well. They asked the way frightened people ask, hoping to borrow certainty. How was he? Did he seem okay? Did he say anything? Dean answered calmly because calm was his armor. He said Elvis was tired. He said Elvis was human. He said nothing that could become a headline. But every time he repeated those words, he felt a strange pressure behind his ribs, like his heart was pushing against a door that would not open. The truth he carried was not a scandal. It was not a secret that would shock the public. It was something more complicated, a moment of softness that didn't fit the world's hunger for drama. Dean worried that if he described those 20 minutes too clearly, people would twist them. They would pull them apart like strangers pulling petals from a flower, not caring that the flower was someone's last. He had seen how the world treated famous men's private pain. It turned it into entertainment. It made it into proof. It sold it. Dean could not bear the idea of those quiet minutes being used like that. At night, when the rooms went silent and there were no more voices to answer, the memories grew louder. Dean lay awake with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of a house that was never fully asleep. He kept hearing Elvis's laugh from earlier in the day, not the polished laugh he used in public, but the real one, sudden, warm, surprised at himself. The kind of laugh that comes out when someone forgets for a second that they're supposed to be strong. Dean wondered if he should have stayed longer. He wondered if he had misread the moment. He wondered if the feeling that drove him to Memphis had been trying to tell him something more specific. But there had been no warning signs that screamed for help, no dramatic last request. There had only been tired honesty and gratitude. That was what made it feel unbearable. There was nothing Dean could point to and say, "This is where I failed." Instead, there was only the quiet question that never had an answer. What if? And the mind's cruel habit of replaying a moment until it becomes a courtroom. In the days leading up to the funeral, people spoke about Elvis as if he were already a statue. They praised his talent. They listed his accomplishments. They told stories of concerts and records and television moments. Dean listened, nodded, and smiled when he was expected to smile. He understood why they did it. People talk about achievements when they don't know how to talk about absence. They talk about what a person did because it's safer than talking about what a person felt. But Dean couldn't stop thinking about what Elvis had felt in that room. Not in a dramatic way. Elvis had not unloaded a speech or delivered a theatrical message. He had simply revealed fatigue, the kind that doesn't always show on stage. Dean realized that most of the world had never truly seen that side of him. They had seen the costume, the voice, the legend. Dean had seen the man behind it, sitting on a bed like any other exhausted human being. And now, Dean was terrified that the world would bury that man under flowers and cameras and noise. On the morning of the funeral, the air felt thick, as if even the sky was holding its breath. Crowds gathered outside with faces full of shock and devotion, people crying openly, people clutching radios and photographs, people who had never met Elvis but had built parts of their lives around his music. Dean understood them. He had been loved by strangers too, and he knew that sometimes a stranger's voice can become the soundtrack that carries you through loneliness. Still, he couldn't shake a private thought that made him feel guilty. The crowd was grieving the Elvis they knew, while Dean was grieving the Elvis no one could photograph. The Elvis who said, "Thanks for coming," like it mattered. The Elvis who laughed at a silly story like a normal friend. The Elvis who did not feel like a symbol in that moment. Dean kept his face steady because grief in public becomes a performance whether you want it to or not. He hated that. He hated that people watched him to see how he would react, as if his expression could confirm something for them, as if his tears were evidence. When it was Dean's turn to speak, he stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. For a second, his mind went blank. He could have delivered a perfect tribute. He could have used beautiful phrases. He could have given them something that would be quoted. But instead, he spoke in a simple voice because simplicity was safer. He talked about Elvis's kindness because behind the scenes, Elvis had often been generous in ways the public never knew. He talked about how Elvis could make a room feel lighter because Dean had watched it happen. He talked about how Elvis loved his daughter because that was a truth that didn't need decoration. And he avoided the upstairs room. He avoided the 20 minutes. He avoided that soft gratitude that still rang in his ears. Dean felt like a man carrying a candle in the wind, shielding it with his hands so the world couldn't blow it out. Not because the world was evil, but because the world was careless. Carelessness was enough to ruin something sacred. After the service, as people moved like shadows through the crowd, Dean stepped aside to breathe. He felt older than he had the week before. Grief has that effect. It doesn't just make you sad, it makes you aware of time, of how quickly the doors close behind you. He was standing near the edge of the gathering when a small figure approached him, Lisa Marie. She looked lost in the way children look lost when adults try to protect them with soft words. Her eyes were puffy from crying, and her face carried a confusion that was too big for her age. Dean's chest tightened because there was no way to explain death to a child without leaving something broken. Lisa Marie looked up at him, and her voice came out quietly as if she was afraid of making the truth louder by speaking. She asked him if her father had said anything. Not because she wanted drama, but because children cling to messages the way drowning people cling to boards. She wanted something to hold. Dean knelt so he could meet her at eye level. In that moment, he felt the full weight of being the last. People always imagine that being the last person to see someone alive means you have a final message, a dramatic farewell, some secret wisdom. But most of the time, the last moments are ordinary, and the ordinary is what haunts you because it proves how fragile life is. Dean looked at Lisa Marie and realized that the truth she needed was not a quote. She needed reassurance. She needed safety. She needed to know she was still loved in a world that suddenly felt empty. He told her father loved her more than anything, because that was true. He told her father would want her to remember him with love, not with fear, because that was true too. He chose his words carefully, not as a storyteller trying to create a scene, but as a man trying to build a bridge for a child across a river of grief. When Lisa Marie nodded, a small, fragile nod, Dean felt something inside him fracture and settle at the same time. He had not saved Elvis, but maybe he could protect something else, the memory that would shape a little girl's future. That night, after the crowds and the cameras and the voices had faded, Dean sat alone again. He stared at a wall and realized the most painful part of the entire day was not the funeral, not the speeches, not the headlines. The most painful part was the quiet moment when Lisa Marie asked her question, because it forced Dean to understand something he hadn't wanted to admit. Those 20 minutes belonged to him, but they also carried a responsibility. He didn't have the right to turn them into a public story. He didn't have the right to decorate them. He didn't have the right to let strangers step into that room and touch it. But he also couldn't pretend they didn't matter. They mattered because they were real, and because they were the last moment Elvis felt seen as a person rather than a symbol. Dean knew he would carry that for the rest of his life, and he didn't yet know what that weight would do to him. In the weeks that followed, grief became something quieter but more stubborn. It showed up in small places. A song on the radio would start, and Dean's throat would tighten unexpectedly. A joke someone told would remind him of Elvis's laugh, and for a second he would forget Elvis was gone, and then the remembering would hit like a door slamming shut. People invited him to talk about Elvis on television, to share memories, to give the public the kind of emotional moment they could consume. Dean declined most of them. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He simply didn't want to turn the last private room into a public stage. He had spent a lifetime performing. He didn't want grief to become another act. Still, the requests kept coming, and each request reminded him that the world wanted a story more than it wanted the truth. The world wanted clean lines, clear reasons, and a neat ending. Dean had none of that. He had only the memory of a tired man saying, "Thanks for coming," and the terrifying realization that sometimes the most important moments in life are small and quiet and impossible to explain. With time, the haunting didn't fade. It changed shape. It stopped being a sharp pain and became a steady presence, like a shadow that follows you even at noon. Dean found himself thinking about that day in strange detail, not because he was trying to punish himself, but because the mind tries to make meaning when it cannot make sense. He remembered the smell of the hallway upstairs. He remembered how the light fell through the window. He remembered the exact tone of Elvis's voice, soft, grateful, almost relieved. Dean began to understand that what haunted him wasn't a secret. It was the knowledge that he had been guided there by something he couldn't name, and that he had arrived just in time to offer something that cannot be measured, presence. The haunting question was, what did Elvis say? The haunting question was, why did I know to come? And if he could know once, why couldn't he know sooner? Why couldn't he know enough to change the outcome? That question, Dean realized, was the kind that never fully leaves a human being. And yet beneath the guilt and the replaying and the weight, another truth began to appear, quiet but steady. Maybe those 20 minutes were not meant to be solved like a puzzle. Maybe they were meant to be honored. Maybe the reason Dean could never forget them was not because he failed, but because he had witnessed something rare. A moment where a man the world called the king was simply a tired friend who felt grateful someone had shown up without being asked. Dean didn't know if that made the loss easier. It didn't, but it gave the pain a shape he could hold without breaking completely. He began to realize that kindness, in its simplest form, is sometimes the only thing that stands between a person and the emptiness they feel. Dean couldn't rewrite history. He couldn't rewind time. But he could remember those 20 minutes as proof that even at the end, a human being can still be seen, still be heard, still be treated like a person and not a legend. And that, more than any headline, was what made Dean's chest tighten when he thought about that day. By the end of that month, Dean returned to his own life because life forces you back into motion whether you are ready or not. The world moved on quickly the way it always does. New songs came, new scandals filled newspapers, new faces rose, but Dean didn't move on the same way. He smiled when he had to, he showed up where he had to, he did what was expected. Yet inside him, something stayed locked in that upstairs room at Graceland, holding 20 minutes like a fragile photograph that could tear if handled too roughly. He didn't speak about it much, not because he was hiding something scandalous, but because he was guarding something sacred. And he understood with a kind of quiet fear that the real haunting wasn't in a dramatic secret. The haunting was in the simple truth that he had been the last friend to look Elvis in the eyes and treat him like a human being. That kind of last is not a trophy. It is a responsibility. It is a weight. It is a memory that follows you into every quiet room and asks you again and again what you could have done differently, even when you know, deep down, that sometimes the only gift you can give is showing up, and even that gift cannot stop time from taking what it wants. In the months that followed, the world did what it always does when someone larger than life disappears. It began rewriting him into something easier to understand. Elvis became a timeline, a collection of achievements, a set of numbers attached to records and stadiums. Biographers rushed forward. Commentators spoke with confident voices about causes and consequences. Documentaries began shaping the narrative before grief had even settled. Dean Martin watched it unfold from a quiet distance, and the strangest part was not that people were talking about Elvis. The strangest part was how certain they sounded. They spoke as if they had been in that upstairs room. They spoke as if they understood the final hours, as if the human heart could be reduced to a neat conclusion that fit into a broadcast segment. Dean rarely argued. He rarely corrected. He had spent decades in show business, and he understood that the public prefers stories that close cleanly. But inside him, something resisted the simplification. Because what he had seen was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. It was something fragile and human, and he knew how easily fragile things get crushed under the weight of interpretation. Invitations to speak publicly about Elvis continued to arrive. Producers believed Dean carried something valuable: proximity. Being the last friend to see Elvis alive turned him into a living footnote in history, and the media has always been drawn to footnotes that feel like secrets. Dean agreed to a few appearances, partly out of loyalty, partly out of obligation, and partly because he understood that silence can be misinterpreted. The first interview took place in a quiet studio, the lights bright but controlled, the atmosphere polite. The interviewer leaned forward with a practiced expression of empathy and asked him what Elvis had been like that day. Dean answered slowly, choosing each word as if it were glass. He said Elvis seemed tired but reflective. He said Elvis had laughed. He said Elvis had appreciated the visit. He did not exaggerate. He did not hint at mystery. Yet even in his restraint, he could sense the interviewer searching for something more, something that could turn into a headline. There was an unspoken hunger in the room, a subtle pressure that suggested the public expected revelation. Dean felt it pressing against him, and he felt a quiet refusal rising in response. The truth did not need embellishment. It was enough that two friends had spoken honestly. It did not need to become legend. As the interviews multiplied, Dean noticed something unsettling. The more he repeated the memory, the more people tried to reshape it. Some writers implied there must have been hidden tension. Others suggested dramatic last confessions. A few hinted at secrets that Dean was supposedly protecting. It was not malicious, at least not entirely. It was simply how storytelling works in a world that craves spectacle. But Dean began to understand that protecting the simplicity of those 20 minutes required discipline. If he allowed even one dramatic interpretation to slip through, it would grow beyond his control. He had seen careers distorted by rumors before. He had watched reputations become caricatures. He refused to let Elvis's final private moment turn into entertainment. That refusal did not make him popular with every reporter, but popularity was not his goal. Integrity was. Privately, however, the silence was more complicated than the public ever imagined. Dean did not struggle because he was hiding scandal. He struggled because memory is never static. The mind revisits moments, turns them over, changes the angle of light, asks new questions. Some nights he would sit alone with a drink and replay the visit in detail, testing it against his own conscience. He would ask himself whether he had sensed something deeper than exhaustion. He would wonder if he should have asked more questions, stayed longer, pushed past the surface. It is a peculiar cruelty of grief that it turns ordinary exchanges into potential crossroads. A sentence that once seemed casual becomes significant. A pause becomes loaded with meaning. Dean knew this, and yet he could not stop himself from re-examining everything. He began to realize that being the last person to see someone alive creates a strange illusion of responsibility. Even when nothing dramatic happened, even when there were no obvious warnings, the mind insists on searching for a missed signal. It is easier to believe you overlooked something than to accept that life sometimes ends without announcement. The public, meanwhile, continued to build its version of Elvis. Concert footage played on television, old interviews resurfaced. Music charts revived his songs as if refusing to let silence win. Fans gathered outside Graceland with candles and flowers, creating a ritual of remembrance that was both beautiful and overwhelming. Dean visited Memphis again months later, not for cameras, not for interviews, but simply to stand quietly near the place where he had last seen his friend. The estate felt different now, transformed into a site of pilgrimage. He walked the grounds slowly, aware that every corner now carried layers of memory not just for him, but for millions. Standing there, he realized something that both comforted and unsettled him. Elvis no longer belonged solely to the people who knew him personally. He belonged to history. And history rarely leaves space for quiet human details. It prefers symbols. One evening, during another television appearance, an interviewer asked him directly whether Elvis had seemed aware of the pressures surrounding him. The question was framed gently, but its implication was clear. Dean paused longer than usual before answering. He could have delivered a rehearsed line about the cost of fame, and it would have satisfied everyone. Instead, he spoke carefully about how fame magnifies both joy and fatigue. He said that people often forget performers are human beings first. He did not speak about hidden despair or dramatic turmoil. He simply reminded viewers that being admired by millions does not remove the need for rest or understanding. As he spoke, he felt a strange calm settle over him. For the first time, he sensed that perhaps the way to honor those 20 minutes was not by guarding them in isolation, but by gently shifting the conversation. If people wanted meaning, he would give them something real, the reminder that kindness matters more than speculation. Still, the haunting did not disappear. It changed form. Instead of replaying the room upstairs, Dean began reflecting on the idea of the last itself. He thought about how many people in the world carry similar burdens without ever appearing on television. The last phone call, the last hug, the last argument, the last laugh. He realized that millions of ordinary lives are shaped by final moments that no one else witnesses. His situation felt amplified only because of who Elvis had been. The weight was universal, the spotlight was not. This understanding did not lighten the burden, but it made it less isolating. He began to see his experience not as a mysterious chapter in celebrity history, but as a deeply human event that anyone could recognize. The lesson was not about legend. It was about presence. Over time, Dean found himself speaking less about Elvis in interviews and more about friendship in general. He told stories about small gestures that matter. He spoke about showing up uninvited when instinct tells you someone needs company. He described the importance of listening without trying to fix everything. Audiences responded to that honesty more than he expected. Letters arrived from people who had lost loved ones and carried their own unanswered questions. They wrote about missed calls, about conversations that seemed ordinary until they were. Dean read those letters quietly, often late at night. He realized that his haunting was mirrored in countless homes across the country. The difference was only scale. Yet there were moments when the pressure returned sharply. On the anniversary of Elvis's death, media outlets renewed their focus, replaying footage and reopening debates. Each anniversary felt like a wave crashing against a door Dean had worked hard to keep steady. Friends sometimes asked him privately whether there was anything he had never shared. They asked not with suspicion, but with curiosity, the natural human desire to know more about the final chapter of a life that had meant so much. Dean would smile faintly and say that some memories are complete as they are. He did not need to add to them. In truth, he feared that if he tried to dissect those 20 minutes too publicly, he would lose their clarity. They would become something else, something exaggerated or misunderstood. And so he protected them not because they were scandalous, but because they were sacred in their simplicity. As years passed, the sharp edges of grief softened into reflection. Dean began to recognize that the haunting was no longer about guilt. It was about awareness. Being the last person to see someone alive forces you to confront the fragility of time in a way few experiences can. It strips away the illusion that there will always be another visit, another conversation, another chance. Dean found himself living differently because of that awareness. He reached out to friends more often. He visited family without waiting for occasions. He learned to listen more patiently. The 20 minutes at Graceland had not given him a dramatic secret. They had given him a permanent reminder that presence cannot be postponed. One afternoon, during a particularly reflective interview, the host asked him whether he believed he had been meant to go to Memphis that day. Dean did not answer quickly. He no longer tried to rationalize the instinct that had sent him driving across states. Instead, he admitted that sometimes life offers us impulses we do not fully understand. He said that listening to them had allowed him to offer companionship at a moment when it mattered. He stopped there. He did not frame it as fate. He did not frame it as destiny. He framed it as choice. He had chosen to go. He had chosen to knock on the door. He had chosen to sit and listen. That was enough. By the end of the decade, the public narrative around Elvis had stabilized into something predictable. The legend had solidified. The debates had cooled. But Dean's private reflection continued quietly, shaping his outlook in ways few people could see. The haunting had matured into responsibility, not the responsibility of revealing hidden truths, but the responsibility of honoring what he had witnessed. He understood that the final gift he could offer his friend was to resist turning those 20 minutes into something larger than they were. They were not dramatic prophecy. They were not theatrical confession. They were gratitude and fatigue and laughter in a quiet room. And that ordinariness, he realized, was the most powerful truth of all, because it reminded him, and anyone willing to listen, that even the brightest stars are human at the end of the day. As Dean grew older, he found that the memory no longer arrived with sharp pain. Instead, it came like a quiet echo, especially on still afternoons when the world seemed slower. He would sit by a window and think about the drive to Memphis, about the way instinct had guided him, about the softness in Elvis's voice. He would think about how easy it is to postpone kindness, to assume there will always be time later. And he would feel a steady resolve settle in his chest, never postpone. The haunting had transformed into guidance. It had become a reminder that presence is not dramatic but essential, that friendship is not measured in grand gestures but in small acts of showing up. In that sense, those 20 minutes did not only belong to the past, they shaped the future of the man who carried them. And though the world continued to analyze, speculate, and remember Elvis in countless ways, Dean held onto a quieter memory, one that required no headline to validate it. He had been there, he had listened, he had offered company, and sometimes he finally understood that is the only thing a human being can truly give another. As the years stretched forward and the sharp shock of loss softened into something steadier, Dean Martin began to understand that the 20 minutes at Graceland were not a wound meant to close. They were a turning point meant to remain visible. Time did not erase the memory. Instead, it clarified it. In the early months, he had replayed the visit with restless doubt, wondering if he had missed a sign or misunderstood a tone. In the years that followed, however, the doubt transformed into something quieter and more reflective. He began to see that what haunted him was not regret over something undone, but awe over something unexpectedly complete. He had gone to Memphis because of an instinct he could not explain. He had walked upstairs and knocked on a door without ceremony. He had sat in a room and listened without trying to fix, rescue, or dramatize. The simplicity of that act began to feel less like coincidence and more like instruction. Dean did not speak about it often in public, but those who knew him closely could sense a shift in his priorities. Fame had once dictated his schedule. Now it held less authority over his choices. Invitations to appear, to perform, to comment on history still arrived, but he filtered them differently. He asked himself whether showing up would add meaning or merely noise. He began valuing unannounced visits more than public tributes. He reached out to friends when he felt the faint tug of concern instead of postponing the call for a more convenient time. He discovered that the lesson he carried from that August afternoon was not about mortality alone. It was about responsiveness. If you feel called to someone, go. If you sense someone is tired behind their public smile, sit with them. If gratitude is spoken softly, honor it. These were not dramatic philosophies, but they were deeply practical. Occasionally, when he was alone, Dean allowed himself to revisit the exact rhythm of those 20 minutes. Not to dissect them, but to hold them gently, the way one holds an old photograph that has begun to curl at the edges. He remembered how ordinary the conversation had been. He remembered how the house felt suspended in quiet heat. He remembered how no grand speeches had been delivered. That ordinariness had once confused him. Now it comforted him. It meant that life's most meaningful exchanges are rarely theatrical. They are rarely rehearsed. They are small and almost invisible at the time. He began to realize that the world's obsession with dramatic endings had overshadowed the deeper truth. Endings are rarely loud. They are often wrapped in everyday language and simple gratitude. That understanding changed how he moved through his own life. In private gatherings, when conversation drifted toward loss, Dean sometimes shared a softer insight without referencing names or dates. He would say that being the last person to see someone alive teaches you two things. First, that you never truly know which moment will be the last. And second, that kindness cannot be delayed. He did not present himself as a moral authority. He spoke as someone who had learned through experience. Friends listened more closely when he spoke that way, sensing the authenticity beneath his calm tone. He had always been known for effortless charm, for an easy laugh and a relaxed demeanor. But those who watched him closely saw a deeper current now, a steadiness that came from having faced something unchangeable and chosen reflection instead of bitterness. As he aged, the public continued to return to the story, especially on anniversaries. Documentaries revisited the timeline. Writers speculated about unseen pressures. Fans debated what might have been different. Dean did not argue with them. He understood that people need narratives to process grief, especially when it involves someone whose music had shaped their memories. But he no longer felt compelled to defend the quiet simplicity of his own memory. It was enough that he knew it. It was enough that he remembered the gratitude in Elvis's voice and the shared laughter over an imperfect performance story. The world could analyze, he would preserve. That quiet preservation became his way of honoring the friendship. There were moments, particularly in the later years of his life, when the awareness of mortality returned with sharper clarity. Watching contemporaries age and pass on has a way of narrowing one's focus. Dean sometimes sat alone in the evening light and considered how easily time folds in on itself. The drive to Memphis felt both distant and immediate, like a scene from another lifetime that still echoed in his present. He no longer framed the experience as haunting. Instead, he framed it as formative. It had reshaped his understanding of what matters. Applause fades quickly. Headlines dissolve. Even legends eventually become archival footage. But the act of showing up remains permanently etched in the conscience. That realization brought him a measure of peace he had not anticipated in the early years of grief. In conversations with younger performers who sought his advice, Dean found himself emphasizing balance over ambition. He would caution them not to let public expectation eclipse private connection. He reminded them that behind every stage curtain waits a human being who needs rest, laughter, and understanding. Though he rarely referenced Elvis directly in these talks, the lesson was rooted in that afternoon upstairs at Graceland. He had seen firsthand how the weight of constant performance can blur the line between persona and person. He wanted the next generation to recognize that distinction before it was too late. His words were gentle but deliberate, and those who listened carefully sensed the sincerity beneath them. The memory of Lisa Marie approaching him at the funeral also stayed with him, not as a moment of pressure, but as a reminder of how truth must sometimes be translated into comfort. He often reflected on how children perceive loss differently from adults. They do not analyze, they seek reassurance. Dean understood that the most important gift he could offer that day had not been information but stability. That understanding influenced how he approached conversations about grief thereafter. He learned to measure his words not by their completeness, but by their kindness. He discovered that sometimes protecting someone's peace is more important than satisfying curiosity. That perspective did not come from theory, it came from lived experience. In his later interviews, when asked whether he ever thought about those final 20 minutes, Dean answered with measured honesty. He admitted that he remembered them clearly. He admitted that they shaped him, but he resisted the temptation to turn them into something dramatic. He described them as simple and human. He spoke about gratitude and fatigue and laughter, and occasionally, when the interviewer expected something more sensational, he allowed a faint smile to surface. He had learned that the public sometimes confuses quiet truth with incomplete truth. He knew better. Completeness does not require spectacle, it requires sincerity. As the years continued, Dean found himself increasingly comfortable with the idea that some moments are meant to remain exactly as they were experienced. He did not need the world to validate them. He did not need to extract a moral that could be framed on a wall. The moral existed naturally. Presence matters. The instinct to show up can be more powerful than the ability to explain why. In this way, the 20 minutes at Graceland became less about loss and more about choice. He had chosen to listen to that inner tug. He had chosen to drive. He had chosen to sit and share ordinary conversation. That chain of choices became the quiet foundation of his peace. Toward the end of his life, when physical strength began to wane and days felt shorter, Dean sometimes closed his eyes and revisited that afternoon not with sorrow but with gratitude. He understood then that he had not been given a burden. He had been given a gift. He had been granted the opportunity to offer companionship at a crucial moment. He had witnessed the human side of someone the world often saw only as an icon. That memory, once heavy, now felt balanced. It was a reminder that even the brightest lights eventually dim, but the warmth shared in their final glow remains. When people later spoke about Dean himself and reflected on his calm demeanor in the face of public tragedy, few realized that the calm had been forged in those 20 minutes. It had been shaped by sitting in a quiet room and understanding that fame does not shield anyone from exhaustion, nor does applause replace friendship. The experience did not make him harder, it made him gentler. It did not turn him inward, it turned him outward, more attentive to subtle needs around him. He had learned that history will always construct grand narratives, but life unfolds in smaller, quieter scenes. In the end, the haunting that once seemed overwhelming became something steadier, a compass. It pointed him toward immediacy, toward presence, toward listening before speaking. It reminded him that instinct deserves attention and that gratitude, when spoken softly, deserves to be honored. The 20 minutes at Graceland did not define him through scandal or secret. They defined him through awareness. He had been the last friend in the room, and he had chosen to simply be there. And as he looked back on his life, with all its laughter and spotlight and long nights of performance, he recognized that no applause had ever meant as much as that quiet acknowledgement. "Thanks for coming." That sentence, simple and unadorned, remained with him not as a ghost but as a blessing. It taught him that the true measure of a life is not how brightly one shines in public, but how gently one shows up in private. It taught him that presence is a promise we make without words, a promise to witness, to listen, to share space in a world that often moves too quickly. And so, as time carried him toward his own final chapter, Dean held that understanding close. He could not change what had happened on August 16, 1977, but he could carry forward the lesson it offered. In doing so, he transformed a haunting memory into a lifelong commitment. Never ignore the instinct to show up, never underestimate the power of sitting quietly beside someone, and never forget that even legends are human when the door closes and the room grows still.